Hello and welcome to the lecture presentation for week 5 of this course in Philosophy 111. And this week we're going to be looking at Andrew Feenberg's critical theory of technology. Feenberg has been publishing works on the philosophy of technology for a couple of decades now or more. He came to prominence with books in the 1990s, and his works have always drawn upon the tradition of critical theory, which is most strongly associated with the Frankfurt School, as we'll talk a little bit about today. And the Frankfurt School was a research institute in Frankfurt in Germany, which started in the 1920s and came to prominence in the 1930s. And many of the founders of the institute left Germany in the 1930s when the Nazis came to power and moved overseas, and developed a powerful critique of democracy in the middle of the 20th century, of the nature of democratic society, and in some cases of the effects of and the influence of technology on the character of that society. So Feenberg picks up this tradition, and what he's really done in his works is he's managed to sort of integrate and update the Frankfurt School tradition by relying on and by drawing on things that have developments that have happened in other disciplines and other areas, and particularly in STS, or science and technology studies, that we'll talk about today, that is a kind of empirical approach to studying science and technology. It's a very sort of sociological approach. It looks at them as social, as happening in a social context. So we'll have a look at that and talk about that, and we'll see that the view that Feenberg develops, we'll talk about how it extends the tradition of critical theory and develops quite a promising contemporary version of the critical theory of technology. All right, so one of the big innovations in Feenberg's work is to link together critical theory and STS, science and technology studies. STS is an interdisciplinary research program that investigates the connections between science, technology, and the broader society. And of course, that includes the environment, it includes the political realm, it includes culture, and it includes ethics and norms, so prevailing ethics and prevailing norms about social organization. So it looks at science and technology as happening in a social context, and as being intelligible from the way we can sort of empirically look at the way that science innovation and technological innovation happens in society, what drives it, what are the groups that do it, why do they do it, what are they interested in, how do people respond. So it looks at technology and science as a kind of social process, and looks at that social process as it happens, as it unfolds in a social context. And it draws some very interesting conclusions from watching that process, from sort of seeing it develop. Again, it's very much opposed to the sort of determinist or essentialist view that we've talked about, that technology is just it's just one idea, it's one thing, and that idea doesn't change. It sort of develops in a linear fashion from a single root. The tradition of STS suggests that science is changeable, is malleable, depending on the social context. That there's no single answer to, and there's no single right way of responding to a technological problem. But other factors like social influence, the prestige of different social groups, that will play a role in determining which type of technology and which technological decisions get made, and which type of technology becomes prominent in society. So as Feenberg puts it, STS proposes the idea of the co-production of science and society. This is something we talked a little bit about in the discussion of feminism as well, that both technology and science and society are sort of, there's a co-production here. One doesn't happen without the other. There it was sort of science and gender as being co-produced in the context of society. And Feenberg's point here sort of picks up on that and puts it in terms of this co-production idea. So science is no longer viewed as a neutral resource above the fray of competing social interests, but is recognized as a social institution influenced by public debate. So that, I think, puts it even a little more strongly. This idea that science is itself a kind of social institution that is that can be influenced and pressured by other social institutions and other social groups, other social interests that may sort of impinge and impact upon it. So this is a significant change here, that science is not viewed as simply a neutral resource. It's not a tool. It's not just something we can sort of use to solve problems, but it is itself a social institution whose form and the sort of shape that it takes and the way it makes decisions and the type of decisions that it makes, all of those things are susceptible to social influence and the role of competing group interests. So this is science is a sort of social thing. It's a social institution, and it's influenced by other social interests. So this is typically the way that science and technology are viewed in the context of science and technology studies. All right, so critical theory and the critique of technology. So the idea of critical theory goes back to the Frankfurt School, and a number of thinkers who developed the idea of the basic critical framework of critical theory as a critique of society, and developed a number of fundamental critiques of the nature of capitalist society in the 30s and 40s, and also in the post-war period. And we'll talk a little bit about Herbert Marcuse in particular, whose 1964 book One Dimensional Man did take up the idea of a technological society, and the idea of technology as being an important part of the way that the social structure is maintained and the class divisions are upheld. So, and Marcuse talked about this idea of technological rationality as a new kind of ideology, and in the post-war period, it was thought that technological rationality had come to replace the idea of free markets and individual choice. That technological rationality was now sort of governing society, but it was governing society in a way that was consonant with, or in agreement with, the interests of powerful actors and powerful groups in society. So for Marcuse, technological rationality isn't sort of a neutral thing. It isn't something that just works for anybody who picks it up. It actually enforces a particular model of society and a particular model of domination of some groups over others, and a particular model of how society's resources are to be distributed. So that was that critique in the 1960s was very influential. So, and of course, feminists have contributed a lot to critical theory, and the number of sort of transitions that it underwent in the late 1960s with the New Left as well. So, as I said, Feenberg is sort of picking up this tradition and taking it further through and putting it into relation with science and technology studies and other areas where we can really see important features of its sort of broader implications for today. Now, Feenberg uses this this phrase, democratic interventions, And when he talks about democratic interventions, he means the use of popular pressure and protest to make technology more conducive and harmonious with the life of a democratic society. So these interventions come from below. They're from consumers. They're from individuals who are affected by technology, who are brought into some relation with it. So he talks about these interventions to address problems and externalities such as pollution and discrimination, typically. So things like pollution were seen as externalities in the sense that it's a byproduct of certain types of business or economic activity, that pollution is produced. Nobody intends to produce it, but it's produced as a byproduct. So the question is who's responsible for addressing that problem, for cleaning it up, for making sure that there's, who pays for that to sort of solve that problem. So, we can understand that's something that might be conducive to democratic intervention, as has sort of happened when communities have suffered from pollution. There's a pushback, there's organization, and a community finds a way to sort of intervene in some way to push back against say business pollution. So that those are those type of interventions to address things like pollution or discrimination as sort of things that may be produced by economic and social action. And the second might be interventions that aim to realize potentials of technology that are left out of existing designs. And that's an important assumption. So that goes back to the idea of technology being a kind of social institution. It's not a sort of determinist linear path. So because it's an institution, it's going to be influenced by other social interests and groups. So there's no single path of technological development. It may be that the way technology actually develops or seems to be developing is sort of leaving out other possibilities or neglecting other possibilities. So here the thought is democratic interventions, public pressure might be brought to bear to bring those to push those sort of excluded possibilities, those unrealized potentials, to make them to sort of push those as alternatives and possibilities instead. And this is, Feinberg will talk about a couple of examples. He mentions where he sees this process happening, that individuals are sort of pushing back against the imposed sort of form of a technology and are trying to realize alternative versions of that technology, trying to sort of sort of push the technology in a different direction and give it additional features or additional design features that will help to realize a particular idea. When he talks about participant interests in this process, Feinberg means individuals who are involved with technical programs and processes as developers or as consumers who have interests related to their own status or position. So they may be involved in the development, and they may be sort of as consumers who, because of their own interests, have a status relevant to it. So they are all participants. So participant interest is somebody who is sort of situated in relation to the technology, such that you have an interest in certain parts of it, or in a certain development, or in having the technology work a certain way. All right, now Feinberg uses this language of what he calls program and anti-program. So we can understand this as follows: that dominant interests, the interests of dominant groups, get materialized in actual technologies as designed in values and purposes. These become technological facts, right? So the idea, the idea is, and we've talked about this when we talked about actor network theory and the idea of objects sort of having built-in norms. That's the claim here, that objects, technological artifacts, can have values designed into them and purposes designed into them. But because they're artifacts, because they're things rather than people, these then become sort of become seen as facts, as though they're no longer values because they're embodied in things. And of course, the problem here, that one of the dangers is that those values then become taken for granted, as though this is the only possible way of doing things. So technology, and this was sort of a point that comes out of critical theory and Marcuse and the Frankfurt School. Technology has this insidious quality, this sort of problematic and somewhat harmful quality, that once values become designed in it, it's easy to mistake those values as simply being facts, as simply being the way things are, and that makes it much harder to push back and sort of recreate forms of technology that embody different values. It's hard to do that once they're taken for granted. So technology makes it difficult for us to see those values, but it's definitely true on this view that objects, technological artifacts, get values designed into them. Now, the AntiProgram, this is the demands of subordinate actors, which at first appear as protests and demands. They appeal to be ideological because they challenge the technical status quo, right? So the point here is, when actors who may be consumers, who may be individuals trying to use the technology as consumers, so they may dislike some features of how that technology works, whether it's a sort of computer or a cell phone or whatever. They may dislike features of that technology, and they might sort of complain and protest, why doesn't it do this? Why can't we do this? Why can't we sort of re-envision it so that we can use it like this? Now, those claims appear to be, and again, this is the sort of the idea that values become facts when they're embodied in technology, that when you challenge those facts, it appears to be an ideological claim, right? In other words, it just appears to be a kind of protest, right? Why can't things be like this? Because it's a challenge to the technical status quo, and the technical status quo is not simply an idea or a consensus. It's an actual physical reality, right? Because those values are actually designed into physical things. So at first, protest appears to be, or pushback appears to be ideological. It appears to be just sort of complaining that things, why can't things be different? But that's because of the way dominant interests actually get materialized in things. So the anti-program demand is bound to appear at first as simply protest and complaint, and if to get off the ground, it has to transform itself into a kind of material program that can transform the way that particular technology or group of technologies work. All right, so Herbert Hooser, who was born in Germany and moved to the US, and worked at the University of California in the 1970s. And he was a critic of technocracy and technocratic rationality, which, as I said, he doesn't take to be a neutral thing. He takes technocratic rationality to be a sort of form of rationality that's informed and sort of imprinted by the interests of dominant groups in capitalist society. So this was in the post-war era, the era of massive corporations, the era of massive institutions, massive military institutions, massive corporations. This was a sort of era of sort of large, large corporations, large industries, and it was run by this system of scientific administration, which in this era was seen as replacing democratic debate and discussion, leading to top-down control of decision making in society as a whole. So Marcuse's critique of this system had really three main elements. He argued that mass media and individual consumption were powerful forces that had sort of reduced the resistance of people with the mass media, and we can of course update this with social media today and the way it sort of encourages a kind of conformism, and the way that it sort of integrates people into existing possibilities and existing ways of doing things. Secondly, he said that technological rationality had itself become a kind of culture of form. That so it almost becomes an institution where we automatically redefine social conflicts as technical problems. So the idea of sort of moral debate and social debate is sort of narrowed down to the point where it's virtually non-existent. Everything becomes a technical problem, right? Everything becomes a kind of technical problem to solve. So technical solutions substitute for any kind of moral or normative discussion of fundamental issues. And thirdly, Marcuse said that technological designs like typically the assembly line, where individuals are situated on the line, they each perform a task, and then the object, the sort of artifact goes down to the next person in the line who performs a different operation on the object. So these things conform to the requirements of top-down control, and in doing so they reinforce the capitalist system. So the assembly line is a good example of a technology that we can see is it's not just a neutral object, but it's enforcing a particular idea of top-down control, and enforcing a particular idea of the easy control and the easy monitoring of workers as they're doing their jobs. So Marcuse thought that a redesigned technology, a revolutionized technology, would be capable of supporting a much more egalitarian system, a system in which people are treated much more as equals. But he saw that this would require a replacement of the sort of top-down form of technology that's come out of this non-neutral idea of technocratic rationality. All right, one big idea in Feinberg, and part of the way he sort of really adopts critical theory to these new challenges, is the idea of a technical code. Now, the technical code allows certain social demands or interests to be embodied in a material object. Okay, and the assembly line is a nice example of this. That certain interests, the interests in having workers be monitored, in having workers do easily controllable and quantifiable tasks, those values are embodied in the assembly line, right? So the technical code is not just about the sort of designs the object. The technical code of an object is not just about technical things. It incorporates social values, social demands as well, and those demands might be about increasing control, increasing top-down accountability, making work quantifiable. All those things have sort of characterized the technical framework of capitalist society. Another nice example here of a technical code that's embodied in an object is what's called El Cortito, which is the short-handled hoe, which I think was introduced sometime in the mid-ish 20th century, and is an example of a technical code embodied in a material thing. So the basic thing here is the short-handled hoe. because the handle's short, you have to bend down to use it. You can't stand up and you can't be standing up straight with your back straight and be using the hoe to weed or to work on the ground. So anybody who's using the short-handled hoe has to be bent down. So it makes it very easy for an overseer to see who's working, because if you're working, you're bent down, you're not your back isn't straight. So the technical code embodied in this object again is about control, quantifiability, about oversight, about supervision. So all of that serves the interests of dominant interests that want to control labor and want to control how people work, and those values here become embodied in the object El Cortito, which then serves the interests of dominant owners. So it's with Mark Hooser, we could say this embodies a technological rationality that's not neutral but serves the interests of control and serves the interests of the domination of some groups over the people who do this kind of work. So from these examples and from the tradition of critical theory, Feinberg suggests this general association of democracy and capitalism, not association in the sense that they promote one another, but this sort of way in which they interact. He says, under the impact of democratic interventions, capitalism might become more humane, but there is an inherent tension in a democratic legitimation of capitalism. The appeal to democracy undermines the centralized technical power that seems to be essential to capitalism. So the inherent tension here in democratic legitimation, that, as we've talked about, in capitalism, the trajectory of technology often seems to lead towards centralized technical power, and it often seems to promote alternatives that lead towards an idea of centralized power, right? And the logic of that is pretty simple, because capitalism is a class-based system that relies on centralized control and relies on the sort of control and monitoring of a population of subordinate workers. So it makes sense that to say, if you sort of go for the idea in STS that science and technology are sort of social institutions, it makes sense then to say that under capitalism, they're going to be pulled into this process of supporting centralized technical power, and the technical innovations that appear are going to be supporting this, are going to sort of support this idea as well. So this is sort of a general thing, and sort of more recent examples might, we can think of here. I wonder how how we would sort of make that viable. One of the things, the technology, for example, in ride-sharing services like Uber and Lyft, and ride-sharing services that have become very, very popular. But those technologies again make use of a technical power that's centralized. In other words, it's an app that's produced by people in Silicon Valley, and the drivers are not, they don't control or own the technology. They're just sort of workers who respond to the commands of the app, right? So we can, it's pretty clear that ride-sharing services like Uber use a kind of centralized technical power, right? So the really interesting question is, does it have to be this way? Could we think of a system? Could we think of a ride-sharing system in which the technical power, rather than controlled by an elite group of owners who take all the profits, why not have a system where the technical power is shared by the riders themselves, who can book rides, who can sort of use it to organize, where it wouldn't be a sort of centralized thing. It would be one that allowed them to assert their own, to work in their own way and to assert their own sort of collective power with other users. So we can see even today, and I'm sure we could sort of think of more examples where we could think of the production of this centralized of devices and mechanisms that create a centralized technical power, which is not a kind of neutral or a natural outcome, but is a result of the logic of capitalism and its promotion of class divisions, which promote the accumulation of capital by certain groups. Okay, let's go on to discuss the second paper this week, which is Feinberg's 2008 paper, Critical Theory of Technology, an Overview. Now, Feinberg starts here by talking about something that we've mentioned before, and this is the idea of technical action as a partial escape from the human condition. So the idea of feedback. In technical action, the actor's impact on the object is out of all proportion to the return feedback affecting the actor. Feinberg's example here of a driver in a car who's hurtling down the highway. So you're inside a very powerful machine when you're driving at high speed, but your impact on the object is out of all proportion to its feedback on you. You're inside you're protected from the elements. You're not exposed to the air and the rain and whatever else. So you're getting very little return feedback, but you're having an immense, a large impact on the object or on the material world. So this creates what he calls a necessary illusion of transcendence. This idea of a feeling of independence or power, we get this sort of feeling of transcendence, of power over things, because of the way in technical action where we seem to have this sort of one-way, unique kind of power over the object that makes us seem like almost godlike in our immunity from feedback and sort of blowback conditions. Now, Heidegger is one of the people Feinberg mentions as taking up this idea, or this illusion, as he calls it, in Heidegger's idea of the essence of technology, and this idea of revealing, that everything is sort of revealed as being useful to human beings, and also in Marcuse's idea of not of technological revealing, but the idea of divisions between classes, divisions between rulers and ruled, and so technology can only sort of be reproduced in a way that reproduces that kind of rule. So the possibility of that structure of class domination is inscribed in the very reality of technology and technical action. So Heidegger's thinking revolves around this idea of revealing, the way sort of the world is revealed as subject to human use. And for Marcuse, the most important thing is the way technology reproduces these social divisions. It reproduces these social divisions and sort of reproduces this sort of character of society in these sort of distinct class-based ways. All right, so in this paper we get Feinberg's idea of instrumentalization theory, and he takes a bit of time to go into this. And the basic idea that it imparts to us is that technology must be analyzed at two levels. At the first level, there's a kind of decontextualizing and de-worlding of objects, so that their useful properties can be identified and controlled. At the second step, designs must be integrated with the natural and social environment, including existing devices and systems, and ethical and aesthetic principles. Right. So these two levels basically make up the kind of two competing big theories of philosophies of technology. The sort of essential view that there's a sort of essential shape of technology that's being taken up in the decontextualization and deworlding of objects, so that you sort of strip down to their useful properties. So there's a kind of essential way of looking at the world in technology that decontextualizes. But the second stage is part of the process as well, and that goes to the insights of STS that have sort of looked at technology as in a social context, as a social institution. So here we have to understand at the second level that technological designs must be integrated with the natural and social environment. So these two steps, according to Feenberg, are always necessary when technology, when we come to sort of looking at technology. So the two levels of instrumentalization theory combine these two ways of looking at things. It combines essentialism, the deworlding of objects, stripping them down to a technical essence, and the social constructivist idea that the way that actors perceive the meanings of the devices and systems they use or they design, and how they influence the direction of technical change. So here it's in a social context, the meanings that are perceived by users and designers, and how they can influence what's designed and how it works. Now, operational autonomy. This refers to the owner of a manager to make independent decisions about the organization, regardless of the views of subordinate actors and the surrounding community. This recalls the idea of technical action as a partial escape from the human condition, right? Owners and managers are, as Feenberg puts it, in a technical relation to the world, safe from the consequences of their own actions. Right, so that's been a big part of the idea of capitalism, the idea of operational autonomy, that somebody who owns a piece of property, or perhaps a manager working on his or her behalf, on behalf of the owner, can make independent decisions about the organization, regardless of what subordinate actors think and regardless of what the surrounding community thinks. Right, so this is an important part of how capitalism works, and to challenge that reality, we need to challenge the fact of operational autonomy, or at least its scope, the sort of extent to which it protects people to make independent decisions. When operational autonomy is extended across society as a whole, it becomes a system of technocracy. Right, so here it's in the context of the whole society. Decisions are taken out of the hands of individuals, and they're made by maybe a sort of small elite of technical experts. So it's a system that depresses and narrows the scope for democracy, for public debate about technology, for public debate about how to use technology, what it means, and how to transform it. And it becomes a system of expert decisions taken by a small elite of people. So that becomes when operational autonomy becomes widespread, what we get is the system of technology which is profoundly undemocratic. All right, so how to prevent the idea of technocracy? How to prevent it coming to fruition. The key idea, according to Feenberg, is finding ways to democratize technology, finding ways to make it more democratic, susceptible to democratic intervention, by finding new ways of privileging excluded values, such as the needs of workers and communities, and realizing them in the new technical arrangements, right? So finding ways to get those excluded values heard, and the subsequent work of finding ways to embody them in the new technology, right? So it's always a question of transforming, of finding ways to transform existing technology in ways that will embody different sets of values. So democratizing technology challenges the sphere of operational autonomy, that sphere in which experts make decisions based on their own interests. It shatters the illusion of transcendence, our sort of independence of the effects of technology, by revealing the feedback loops to the technical actor, enlarging the range of interests and voices to make it more difficult to offload feedback from the object onto excluded or disempowered groups, right? So the illusion of transcendence comes from that sense of independence of operational autonomy, that you're making decisions based on your own interests and making sort of technical decisions. But that operational autonomy is based on a kind of illusion, because it's based on the immunity of the actor to these feedback loops of the person making technical decisions, right? So the goal of outside interests, the goal of democratic participants and excluded voices is to remind and to make clear the nature of that feedback, to make clear the way that technical decisions affect everybody else, to make clear the way that a particular choice is going to affect a distinct group of people, and to bring that feedback into the public domain so that excluded or disempowered groups can make their voices heard in the process of the discussion and the design of technology. So it shatters that sort of transcendence and challenges the idea of operational autonomy by bringing these excluded interests and these excluded voices to the fore, and making the sort of the question of technology a kind of social discussion, a debate among various social interests with different values. All right, let's look at the example Feenberg uses in this essay, and it's one obviously that is of interest to us because he talks about computers and online education. Interestingly, he refers to a struggle that has been carried out, really, I guess, since the late 1990s. And on the one side, we've got corporate strategists who want to sell their sort of course materials, who want colleges and professors to buy these different online course material packages, together with legislators and college administrators. So those groups have been pushing a particular view of online education. And on the other side, we've got users, students and faculty pushing a different model of online education, right? So we're going to see in this example that we'll see that, just precisely the struggle that Feenberg has been talking about, where we get, powerful groups like corporate strategists, legislators and administrators, trying to sort of use operational autonomy to enforce a particular model of online education, right? And we've got people on the consumer end of that, users and students and also faculty, who have been trying to get their voices heard, have been trying to sort of make their voices heard to push a different model of what online education means, of how it should work. One that's not about sort of buying materials, one that's not about pre-prepared tests, but is a more sort of dialogical and interactive and social way of thinking about education, where it's sort of more like a classroom than sort of like a sort of computer task. So these two sides have been sort of struggling in precisely the way that according to Feenberg and STS, that's the way we would expect science and technology to work as a social institution, and to be amenable to being sort of influenced by different values. So the struggle basically has been concerned with the question of this question: is the computer a one-way information source, or is it a communication medium supporting human development and community, right? So you get very different models of online education depending on which view you take. If it's a one-way information source, then of course the user or the student is largely passive, largely sort of doing tasks in a passive way, in a sort of individualized way, in isolation from other users. Whereas if it's a communication medium, then very different possibilities suggest themselves, right? There has to be interaction, there has to be some kind of group dynamic, there has to be some kind of community, right? So whichever choice we make is going to radically affect what online education looks like. And also we can say, as Feinberg points out, the struggle exemplifies the divide between democratic and technocratic models. According to the faculty or the user or the student model, the machine is not a window onto an information mall, but rather opens up onto a social world that is morally continuous with the social world of the traditional campus, right? So it's not a device for sort of processing information. It's a sort of surrogate social world, one way where you can have the same kind of interactions, where you can have the same kind of learning experiences that you would have in a traditional classroom and on a traditional campus, and the same kind of social experiences that you would have in any kind of classroom. So the user on this view is part of an interactive community, not just a consumer, right? So this is the struggle around the meaning of online education, of sort of which, is the user, is the student a passive consumer consuming information, or is the student part of an interactive community? And that's the vision for which, faculty and student groups have been struggling to make online education, to give it more of that quality. But in order to do so, of course, you have to sort of challenge and you have to fight back against the sort of imposed technocratic model that favors the interests of dominant groups, like publishing companies that want to sell their models sell their sort of software models to faculty, and colleges, and administrators who want an easily manageable and cheap version of online education that doesn't cost a lot of money. So these models are all sort of pushing back against those interests of dominant groups. All right, so to conclude and sort of think about where we are at the end of this week, I think Feinberg's work addresses important concerns about technology and its relation to democracy. And as I said, he represents an important tradition of critical theory, which has had a lot to say about technology and technocratic society in the 20th century and on into the 21st. And he brings this tradition and its thinking up to date in relation to, I think, our current challenges around technology. He argues against the idea of determinism, that the meaning of a technology depends on which social group is able to prevail in having its favored interpretation become widely accepted. So it's never a fait accompli what a technology is going to look like when it becomes socially dominant. That depends on the struggle among groups for which interpretation, which idea is going to become socially favored. A technology will always incorporate certain social values in the form of a technical code, right? And as we said, that code will appear as though it's a kind of fact because values have been given a material form, right? But we can if we can interpret and if we can unpack the code, we can find the values that went into make it up, as we saw with El Cortito. A technology can incorporate values of control and dominance, and when we sort of interpret what it's doing and think about alternatives, we can sort of unpack the meaning of the code. So think if you can come up with other alternatives of a technical code and how it works. This is going to be the discussion board task this week. So have a think about sort of technologies that we're familiar with and how they might sort of embody different values, and see what you can do with that idea. All right, good luck for this week.